Hello Year 5 and welcome to your geography lesson for this week. Now we're going to continue on with our lesson we started last week looking at how mountains are formed. So let's have a quick recap to see what you remember from last week. Now we looked at two different types of mountain formations last week. So what I would like to do is look at this picture. This picture is the Himalayas. And what I would like you to pause the video and think about is what type of mountains are the Himalayas and how do you know? So think back to the two mountain formations we looked at last week and see if you can work out which one the Himalayas is and how that you know. So pause the video and have a go. Okay, so the Himalayas are actually fold mountains. Okay, now we can see this because all the different peaks all point in different directions, and that means that all the peaks as they've come up through the surface have all pushed against each other, and this is as a result of that rock being pushed up from the ground where those tectonic plates have collided. Now we know that when they're fold mountains, because they push together, rather than going over the top of each other, they push up. So as they push up against each other, they're pushing all of that rock that goes up. Now, we always also know that fold mountains will tend to be found along the edges of where the tectonic plates meet. So well done if you got that correct. Okay, so we have fold mountains, which is what we looked at last week. Okay, now we know that fold mountains are created when those plates are pushed together. Okay, and all that rock that comes up is that sedimentary rock that's coming all the way from the ocean floor and it wrinkles and folds. Okay, we also looked at fault block mountains. Okay, so this is when the cracks in the earth start to show and certain amounts of rock is either dropped down or is then pushed up. Okay, and it creates that up-down effect with our mountains. Now we can always tell which one is a fault block mountain because it's always a very steep, very sharp drop on one of the sides. Okay. So a good example of those types of mountains is the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. So we can see here the very sharp, steep drop on one side. So we're going to look at the last three mountain formations though. So we're going to start off looking at volcanic mountains, okay? Now volcanic mountains are formed around volcanoes, okay? So all that hot lava that comes up from the ground each time there's eruption sets and cools, and it creates a layer of ash from that cooled lava. And every time it erupts, that new layer forms on top, and obviously that volcano or mountain gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, an example of this is Mount Vesuvius, a very, very, very famous volcano. Okay, this goes back to looking at your topic that you would have looked at a few years ago in year 2 or year 3 about Pompeii. So this is a volcanic mountain that's based in Italy, and it's a very active volcano. We then have dome mountains. Now, dome mountains are very smooth and very rounded, and they tend to almost stick up very straight and very vertical. Now, they're formed when that magma, so that really hot substance from the inside of the Earth's core, is forced up between the crust and the mantle. So the two top layers of our Earth's crust. But because it pushes all the way up, it doesn't actually crack all the way through. So because it doesn't create a hole at the top like it would with a volcano, it gets stuck. There's no release for it to come flowing out on top of that Earth's crust. So what it actually does is it creates a bubble. So that bubble creates like a dome surface along the top, right underneath the Earth's crust. So the magma effectively then turns into a solid lump, and that becomes the land. So it's like a bubble. So it's a balloon bubble of then what becomes solid solid lava. So it becomes the ash, the very solid lava. Now, an example of this is the Devil's Tower in the USA, and you can see here that obviously this is the Earth's crust that would originally have been flat with the rest of the land. But as that magma has forced its way up, it hasn't quite managed to poke its top right through that Earth's crust. Instead, it's been pushed all the way up and up and up and up and up until it then solidified. So that is an example there of what we call a dome mountain. And then our final one we're going to look at is called the Plateau Mountains, okay? Now, these are very different and very unique in comparison to the other mountain types because they've not formed because of any form of rock or magma being pushed up from our Earth's core. So actually what it is they're formed because materials have actually been taken away from that crust on top of our Earth. And that's usually through erosion. So when weather or certain events have worn away at the edge of that mountains or worn away at the edge of our materials, and that then cuts through a very deep valley. Okay, so it can either be a valley or what we call a gorge, and that usually tends to happen next to very high cliffs. So where there's an edge of a cliff, that's going to start being eroded away, and there'll be gaps where it will start to drop. So here you can see an example here of where erosion is almost channeled right the way through this ridge here. So it's created steep ridges on both sides, but it's almost isolated these different formations here. So what would have been flat land, we've created mountains by actually creating valleys that run between. Okay, so you have the Allegheny Mountains in the USA, and here you can see an example of them here. Although this would have been flat land at one point in time, they've been formed into mountains because of the edges have actually eroded, creating deeper valleys in between. Okay, so we've got our 3 different types of mountains that we've looked at there. So let's explore some of the pictures that we've got here, okay? So here is an example of a dome mountain, okay? So here you can see how it's been pushed up. There's no peak, there's no point, but it's been pushed all the way up through the earth. Now, a very famous one you might have heard of that we have in this country or in another country. We've got a couple of formations. It's called the Table Mountain. And we call it the Table Mountain because it's flat all the way across the top like a table. Now here is a pure example of where that magma has been forced up right between the crust and the mantle, so right between the very edges of where our earth crust then comes up. But obviously because there's no hole like there would be for a volcano to allow that magma to flow out, it's been pushed up, and as it's got to that peak, it's then cooled, and as a result has then created that mountain formation. Now here is an example again of our Plateau Mountains, okay? So you can see what would have originally have been this flat land at a higher level. We've created those gorges and those valleys, which then creates that steep cliff edge that goes right the way up the side. And if you meandered and walked all the way through there, that's part of the valley. And on each side is where you're going to have that split, okay, of our cliff forms, okay? So those aren't, remember, the plateau ones aren't formed by any forcing of rock or magma through the Earth's surface, but actually it's almost the opposite, where we've started with a large piece of land that's been cut and eroded away that's then created our mountain. Now here is a very typical picture of a volcanic mountain. Now, although it's a volcanic mountain and we know that it's going to be very, very hot, because a lot of these mountains are very high and very high up into the sky, so it can be quite cold. And in some countries, it gets to the point where they will be covered in snow. But that's not going to have any effect on whether that magma is then going to come out and it will then create that next layer. So obviously volcanic mountains will get bigger and bigger, especially mountains that are active volcanoes. If they are active volcanoes and they're continuously erupting, that means they continuously have that flow of that molten lava that's then going to cool and create a new layer. And every time it flows and cools and flows and cools, obviously that mountain peak gets higher and higher. Okay. Also, though, with that ash as well, it's quite fertile for them to be able to grow land and crops on them as well. But equally can be quite dangerous to be very close to. Okay. So for your activity for this lesson, I have created a table where you need to identify the different type of mountain formations and explain how those mountains are formed. So it's almost going to be a bit of a retrieval activity. So you may need to go back and watch our geography lesson from last week on Friday. Now, I would have set you some other activities for you to have a go at. But my only problem is I cannot rely on your parents or your guardians having all of those resources at home. But if you would like to have a go at making any of our mountain formations, specifically the volcanic ones, because there are some experiments that you can do with bicarbonate of soda and some water and some vinegar that creates that chemical reaction that's going to allow that bicarb to foam up and fall out. But it would require you to be able to make or design your own volcano as well. So I'm going to leave that activity up to you. If you would like some additional ideas, you can have a look on YouTube or on Google for some ideas of how to build your own volcanoes or to build your own mountain formations. So by all means, have that as an extra activity if you want. But the main activity is to have a go at filling out that table and see if you can label the different types of mountain formations, looking at the pictures, and then explain how they're formed. I might also get you to have a look at giving me some examples of some different mountain ranges that are specific types of mountain formations. So you will need to go back and watch last week's video and today's video to help you out with that activity. But I look forward to having a look at the work that you do complete and any additional building of our mountains that you guys do at home. Okay, so don't forget to send me in some pictures. Okay, good luck, year 5.